Okay, so if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and I'll try and check them periodically. But I won't be able to see a lot of them until I get done with my presentation. Switch over here. So right now you should be able to see my screen, which says Unit 3 aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So we're going to talk about tonight is the big one. And the big one is that big graph that we can apply to any of the units that we've learned about in AP Macroeconomics, and that's aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So what we're going to learn about in this unit is not only how to graph certain macroeconomic situations, but also how to use things like the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier and how they can be applied to those determinants that you learned about in Unit 2. So if you think back to Unit 2 dealt with the big three determinants, and that was unemployment, inflation, and real GDP or GDP. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to build off of that and say, okay, when there's certain macroeconomic situations that occur, what's the effect on those three? What's the effect on inflation and GDP and unemployment? And how does the government step in to rectify those situations? So then we'll introduce the concept of fiscal policy and multipliers. Okay, so let's get into it. So aggregate demand, you got the upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. You have the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Aggregate demand is downward sloping for those three reasons. When prices are lower, people feel more wealthy. People have more money to spend due to lower prices. The interest rate effect, when interest rates are lower, it cheapens the cost of borrowing. So people borrow more and thus spend more. So that car that you might not have purchased when there was a 6% interest rate, with a 2% interest rate, now you're very interested and motivated to buy the car and take out a loan for the car. So that's the interest rate effect. People demand more goods and services when interest rates are lower. And then a foreign exchange / trade effect, meaning, and that connects back to the wealth effect. When prices are lower in this country, think about it. When prices are lower, foreigners are more motivated, have more incentive to buy our goods and services. So if you wanted to, for simplicity's sake, if you wanted to compare United States prices to the prices of, say, Germany, and in Germany, let's say the inflation rate in Germany is 4 to 5%, but the inflation rate here in the United States is only 1%. And as a result of that, we're going to assume that all of the things are equal, like the exchange rate between countries, the euro and the dollar is equal, to keep it simple. So if you were a foreigner living in Germany, a German citizen, you're going to buy more American goods because those American goods are cheaper. They're costing less. And that's another reason why demand is downward sloping. When prices for our goods and services is lower, not only do we buy more of them, but foreigners buy more of them. That's the foreign exchange effect, okay? So the first three bullet points you see there are just reasons why the demand curve is downward sloping and isn't upward sloping. So if you think of a downward sloping demand curve, as price falls, people buy more of stuff. Those three bullet points explain why. Interest rates, wealth, and the influence of foreigners. Supply, short run aggregate supply. Remember, there's two supply curves that we introduce in this unit, and they're shown here. You have the long run aggregate supply curve that's vertical, and you have the short run aggregate supply curve that's upward sloping. The reason why it's upward sloping has to do with the relationship between inputs and the short run. In the short run, inputs, at least one input is fixed, and it's usually wages. Meaning, like, if you were working for Kohl's, right here in Woodstock, or Farm and Fleet, and you're not satisfied with your pay, and you walk into your boss's office and ask them for a pay raise, they're probably not going to give you a pay raise on the spot. I mean, some might, but overall, people's wages don't change overnight. They change on given time periods. Usually people get raises at the beginning of the year or when the new fiscal year starts for their company. Like for us, for teachers, our raises go into effect at the start of the next school year. Like I couldn't walk into my principal's office or Dr. Moan's office right now and say, hey, Dr. Moan, I want a pay increase for the rest of the year. No, that wage is fixed. It's fixed by a union contract with us, and he's not going to change that overnight. It'll change at a given time period. So long story short, in the short run, wages usually are fixed, which means as a business raises its prices, you can see on this model here, as a business raises its prices, because its inputs, i.e. wages, are fixed, its costs are going to remain fixed, and its revenue is going to increase. Think about it. If you're paying $1,000 to your employees, and you're aware that you don't have to give them raises until next year, as you raise your price, we're assuming that all other things are equal, so people are still going to buy your product as you raise your price. As you raise your price, if your costs stay the same, but now you're making more money, now you have more incentive to supply because you're getting more in revenue, which you can use to produce, which is why this short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. The reason why the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical is because in the long run, there's no relationship between prices and GDP. And this goes into economic corrections that we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, so you got to know this graph. You got to be able to, if given a certain macroeconomic situation like a recessionary gap or an expansionary gap or long run equilibrium, you got to be able to graph this out. And from there, you can use this graph to identify the effect policies and situations have on those big three and others: real wages, price levels, unemployment, employment, GDP, government budgets. You could use this one for a lot of different macroeconomic situations. Okay, given that, make sure you can use the graph to analyze. You got three graphs there. They're all the same variables: long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand. But notice that A, B, and C there are all different in terms of where the equilibriums are. So for like option A, what is option A illustrating? For option B or graph B, what is graph B illustrating? And graph C. So graph A would be an example of a recessionary gap because your equilibrium is behind of where long run aggregate supply is. You're in a recession. I guess I should talk about that really quick too. Long run aggregate supply. I touched on it in the video this morning or this afternoon about units 1 and 2. But long run aggregate supply not only represents long run aggregate supply, it represents what? Full employment, the natural rate of unemployment. This is your measuring stick. This is where your economy needs to be. So if your economy is at Y1, like in this graph, that's a good thing. That means you're at full employment. There's no cyclical unemployment, and that's the goal. You've met the goal for the economy, goals set by the government and by the Fed, the central bank. So if you're behind that, you're not at that goal. Your GDP is too low. Your unemployment is too high. If you're ahead of that, you're doing too well, meaning now there's starting to be a concern about inflation, about price levels. So I kind of buried the lead there, but option A would be a recessionary gap because your short run equilibrium, again, short run equilibrium, you got to know what short run equilibrium is. Short run equilibrium is where aggregate demand, the red curve here, that's downward sloping, and short run aggregate supply, this blue curve that's upward sloping, it's where those two intersect. That's short run equilibrium. So because it's behind long run, you're in a recession. Here, where's the equilibrium for the short run? Well, it's ahead of long run. It's ahead of full employment. So that means your economy is doing really well. So that's an expansionary gap. Graph B would be an expansionary gap. And then graph C over here, where's your short run equilibrium? Well, it's intersecting long run. Now you're in long run equilibrium, meaning right where you're supposed to be. So given an economic situation, the AP could give you this in a graph, and you might have to identify what it is. They could give it to you in the form of, well, I'll get to some of those options in a little bit in the practice FRQs for the sake of time. Know your shocks, know your 4 shocks, know your positive demand shock, know your negative demand shock, your positive supply and negative supply shock, and the effect of those on the usuals, the determinants, okay? RW stands for real wages, PL stands for price levels, RGDP stands for real gross domestic product, okay? Nice little Dwight Schrute reference working there, and the GIF isn't working for me, but hope you enjoy the Office reference. Also, given a macroeconomic situation, like here, like in graph A or graph B, you have to be able to explain. I can almost guarantee you that this will be one of the questions on the FRQ. You have to be able to explain how the economy corrects itself over the long run, all right? So really quick, I'm just going to do one of them. Let's say our economy is in situation A, graph A, okay? Remember that is a recessionary gap, which means that GDP is falling, unemployment is rising. So people are desperate for work. People are out of work, they're out of jobs, they're looking for work and they can't find it because nobody's hiring. All right. Over time, as people exhaust their unemployment benefits and all of their benefits available to them while they're unemployed, because unemployment benefits don't last forever, people become desperate for work and therefore begin to bargain for lower wages. This is like a classical theory related to economics. This is like classical economics at work here. And what it's saying is people are going to accept lower wages just to get a job. So that engineer that might have been making $35 an hour before the recession hit, who is laid off now for 10 months, now is going to accept $22 an hour as an electrician or as a laborer just to get a job and to feed himself and his family. So those lower wages represent lower input costs. It's now cheaper for businesses to produce because now they're paying their employees less. So over time, without government interaction and lower wages, this short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right. And if you could visualize, I wish I could draw it, but I can't. But if you can visualize a rightward shift here in supply, now what's happened? Now your graph should look more like graph C because of the lower input costs, supply increases, and now you're back at full employment. Okay? So you got to be able to explain long-run adjustments. That's really what it's known as long-run corrections, long-run adjustments. Yep. Fiscal policy. So let's say the long-run adjustments that I just talked about very rarely occur anymore because of politics. You know, congressmen and women, they want to be reelected. And how do they do that? Well, they show that they can help people. So what they're going to do here is during recessions or expansions, the government usually will step in because of political motivations and because it's their job to try and assist people. All right. And they have 2 tools. The government has 2 tools. Federal government. Taxes and government spending. Okay. Keep in mind that if you encounter a term known as discretionary spending, what discretionary spending means is it's a spending measure that requires congressional authorization, meaning congressmen and women have to vote on it. It doesn't just happen without their vote. They got to vote on it. So like about 3 or 4 years ago now, about 3 years ago, our Congress passed a series of tax cuts designed to stimulate the economy, help businesses, put people to work. That's discretionary policy, discretionary spending, okay? An automatic stabilizer is the opposite. It doesn't require any government action. So right now, millions of people, I thought the number for April was 10 million people. It could have been more. Millions of people are applying for unemployment benefits. It's not like every time you apply for unemployment benefits, your congressman or woman has to approve it. They don't have to. They already passed that law. It's in place so that in recessions, automatic stabilizers help ease the pain of a recession. Now people have unemployment benefits. It's kind of makes the pain of a recession go away, or it diminishes it to an extent. During expansions, how does that work? Well, we have tax rates, right? The more money you make, the higher the taxes you're going to pay. So as the theory goes, as expansions occur, what does that mean? People are making more money. There's more people working. GDP is higher. So if you're making more money, you're getting more raises and stuff like that, getting better paying job. Now you're going to pay more in taxes. So during expansions, this automatic stabilizer of tax rates kind of cools the economy off and keeps it from overheating. So that's an automatic stabilizer. Make sure you know the difference between those two things. With fiscal policy, and I'll talk about this again with monetary policy, that organizer that I shared with you guys in class, and I've shared, I think, a couple times now through email over the last couple weeks, is really important. So if I were to click on that, it looks like, once you see it, it'll probably ring a bell. It looks like this. On one side, you have the government reaction to when there's expansions, like when the economy is overheating. I know you're looking at this sideways. You can pull it up on your own and crop it and rotate it. And then you have recessions on the other side. So this has a ton of great stuff that I strongly recommend you have present when you take that exam on Thursday. If you lost it, misplaced it, or never completed it in the first place, now you have the link for it, and you have the video that I made. It's a YouTube link that I talk you through how to fill out the organizer. So I strongly, strongly recommend you do that. Here's how fiscal policy works. If you're faced with an expansionary gap or an inflationary gap, the two terms are interchangeable, meaning the economy's ahead of full employment, it's at risk of overheating, like is shown in this graph here. What the government theoretically should do is they should increase taxes and decrease spending. What's the point of this? Well, you want to get prices under control. How do you do that? You lower aggregate demand, because by lowering aggregate demand, it's going to decrease prices. So you do that by taking money away from people. So you got to be able to dissect this, guys, and be able to think, all right, what do I want to do here? If I was in charge of policy and I saw this, somebody presented me that said, with a problem that said, hey, inflation's out of control. How do we get this under control? Well, take money away, lower prices. How do you do that? Okay, make people pay more to you and pay less to them. And these are some of the effects, all right? If the government were to pursue something like this, if they were to cut spending, increase taxes, this last one's important too. You got to be able to know the effect it has on a budget. Moves their budget towards a surplus. Now the government's taking more in than they're spending. They're going to move towards a surplus in their budget. On the opposite end, if you are a congressman or woman and you're faced with a recessionary gap, as shown in the graph there, what do? How do you get people back to work? How do you get businesses producing again? How do you put wealth back in people's pockets? Well, you cut taxes, because now people are taking more of their at-home pay, of their take-home pay, and you would increase government spending. You would approve infrastructure projects, which give money to construction companies, and you would approve spending on healthcare and education and military, all that good stuff, okay? And it's listed there. The trade-off, and there's an economic trade-off with every situation possible, is that now you're moving more towards a deficit in your budget. Think about it this way. You take out a loan right now for a credit card. Start putting a bunch of money on that credit card. And at the same time, you're laid off from your job because of COVID-19. So now you're not taking as much money in, you're not making any money, and now you're racking up all this debt. Your personal budget's moving towards a deficit. So sometimes putting it in your own perspective helps understand what this means. Okay? Make sure you know your inflation. When people demand more goods and services, this is demand pull inflation. This is what this is known as is when you have people buying more goods and services, too many dollars chasing too few goods and services. It makes it more scarce. So suppliers, producers drive up the price of whatever it is they're selling because they know people want it and there's a lot of money going around. They can sell it for higher. Demand pull inflation, right? Cost push inflation, there's two types of inflation. It's when demand goes right or supply goes left. So cost push inflation creates that economic condition known as stagflation. Stagflation is the Toby of the economy. I should have put a Toby gif in there. Maybe I will after this. Nice little Office reference, but Toby is the worst in the Office, and this is the worst of the economy. All right. So when stagflation occurs, you have, look at the effect on GDP. It's going left. When GDP decreases, what happens to unemployment? People are producing less. That means there's less need for workers. Unemployment's higher. Look at price levels. Again, if you graph it, graph will take you to the answer. Prices are higher. It went from P1 to P2. Got to be able to read and analyze a graph. That's really important. Okay. A little typo there. I'm going to correct that right now. So that's cost push inflation. Then, last but not least, know your equations. If the government wanted to increase taxes, increase spending, or vice versa, there's got to be methods, ways out there that economists can use to try and predict like what the effect that's going to be of a tax increase on GDP or a spending increase on GDP. What they base it on are people's spending habits. So the two types of spending habits are listed right there in the first two bullet points. If I gave you an additional dollar right now, gave you a dollar bill, George Washington, and I asked you, of that $1, how much of it are you going to spend? How much of it are you going to save? Because remember, people are only can do two things with money. They can either save it or spend it. Those are the only two choices you have. Stuff it under your mattress, you're saving it. Okay? You go and buy McDonald's with it, you're spending it. So of that $1, that $1 that I gave you, how much of it are you going to spend? If you told me all of it, your marginal propensity to consume would be 100. What that's saying is for every additional dollar you get in disposable income, you're going to spend 100% of it. Now, that's not really the case for most people. Most people's marginal propensity to consume is somewhere in like the 60 to 70% range. It varies with age groups and demographics. Here's how you figure it out. You take the change in spending and divide it by the change in income. Okay. So again, I gave you $1 and you spent, say, 90 cents of it. Okay. The 0.90 would be your change in spending. The change in income would be the dollar. 0.90 divided by 1 would be 0.90. Okay. Your marginal propensity to save is your change in savings divided by your change in income. So let's say of that dollar, you saved 50 cents of it and spent 50 cents of it. Okay. 0.50 divided by 1, change in the dollar would be 0.50. Remember, these two, MPC plus MPS, they have to equal 100. Can't do anything else with it. These are your multipliers. Your spending multiplier, that has to do with the government spending money. If the government increased spending on infrastructure, all that good stuff. 1 over MPS, right? So let's say that your MPC is 0.80. That means your MPS is 0.20. 1 divided by whatever MPS is. Your tax multiplier is going to be smaller. The tax multiplier will always be smaller than the spending multiplier because basic economic theory holds that when government cuts taxes, there's less of it that gets back to people. There's leakages in the economy. So the tax multiplier is less. So the tax multiplier is not MPS minus or divided by MPS. It's MPC. I think I caught that. I would have screwed you guys up on the exam. It's MPC divided by MPS. Okay. Give examples for you there. Here's how to use these. If you were given a change in aggregate demand, meaning that the government has done something to aggregate demand, investment is increased by $4 billion. Consumers are spending $2 million more. The net exports is increasing by $1,000. What you're going to do is this. First, find the multiplier. So I'll give you an example right there. If your MPC is 0.80, that means that your multiplier is 5. Because 1 divided by MPS, 0.20, is 5. And you might be thinking, all right, why 0.20? Why not 0.80? Remember, it's 1 divided by MPS, not MPC. So if MPC is 0.80, you put it with MPS, it's got to equal 1. So 0.80 plus X, this case, it would be 0.20, it equals 1, which is why you're dividing by 0.20. Hope that makes sense. What you're going to do then is you're going to take that multiplier of 5 and multiply it by the change in aggregate demand. In this case, aggregate demand is increasing by $4 million. So 5 times 4 means that you would get a $20 million increase in real GDP. So that's one way the AP, the College Board, could take a topic like this and phrase the question. They could frame it another way. They could give you a goal. So if you look at the example here, let's say current GDP is at $200 million, but the government, their planners, they wanted a 250. So there's a $50 million gap between what it is and what they want. How do you figure that out? Like, how does the government close that $50 million gap? What you would do, again, first, find the multiplier. Multiplier is 10. Because if the MPS is 0.10, 1 divided by 0.10 is 10. Okay? You're going to divide that goal of $50 million by the multiplier. Goal divided by multiplier, and what you're going to get is $5 million. Which means that if the government wanted to get GDP from $200 million to $250 million, you would have to increase consumer spending, investment spending, business, government spending, or net exports, one of them. You got to increase it by $5 million. You can validate it by using the multiplier. 10 times 5 would be 50 million. So you'd be able to close the gap. Okay. Tax multipliers. Same thing here, except you're using the different tax multiplier formula. Okay. So if you're given a goal, the government has increased taxes. Not a goal, I'm sorry. If you were given a change, if the government were to increase taxes by $2 million, remember, I underlined here increases because this is going to have a detrimental effect on the economy, a negative effect on the economy, because the government's taking money away from people here. So it's going to be a decrease in GDP. 0.80 of MPC means that your MPS is 0.20. So 0.8 divided by 0.2 is 4. Your multiplier is 4. 4 times the $2 million, that's the increase in taxes, means that GDP is going to decrease by real GDP. That screws some kids up. They automatically think, all right, tax multiplier, it's going to lead to an increase in GDP. If taxes are going up, GDP is going down. Okay? Assuming all other things are equal. We're not getting into the government's then going to take that tax money and then spend it and benefit certain people. We're just looking at right now, the government's just taking money from people. Okay? Let's say the government now has a goal. GDP again is 200 million. They wanted to get it to 220 million. So there's a $20 million gap they want to close. Well, use your multiplier. I kept the MPS the same. 0.8 divided by 0.2 is 4, just for simplicity's sake. 0.8 divided by 0.2 is 4. The goal, again, you have a $20 million gap here. Goal divided by multiplier is 5. It's not a number 5. Look at me, I'm finding all these typos. 5. So the government would have to decrease taxes by $5 million to increase GDP by 20 million. All right. There's a video you can watch from Mr. Clifford, Mr. ACDC himself, which reviews everything that I pretty much talked about for Unit 3. But if you want it from a different perspective, have at it. This is the College Board's review of Unit 3. And then here's some practice FRQ. So let's just do a couple of them. Talk for a long time. Try to keep this going for like 10 more minutes, and then I'm going to be done. So I'll try and get through a couple of these guys, and then the rest you could try it on your own. And if you have questions, just email me. All right, in this case, you're always going to start with your FRQs. You're going to start with some type of scenario, a situation that isn't a question. It's just like a prelude, a precursor of what's to come. Here it is right here. Blow it up for you here. Assume that the economy of Northland is in a recession with a balanced budget and adequate trade partners. Now, there's some fluff here. There's some stuff you don't need in order to answer the following set of questions. And that is all this highlighted stuff. AP is just going to throw that in there just to give you something else to think about. There's one word that you should be focused on here. See if you can pick that out right now. And that one word is recession. Knowing that the economy of Northland is in a recession, you should be able to answer this very first question. And this is a multiple choice question. Look, you got three options: at, behind, or ahead, right? If you're in a recession, you should know that your short run equilibrium is behind. You're to the left of full employment. That's all you got to answer. All you have to do is say behind. If you really don't know, then you really need to go back and study. But if given this on the test, at least you got a 33% shot, then you can guess. But just graph it. Recession, behind. Think about the graphs I went over earlier in the video here. That's all you got to do. Part B. Now we're given a new macroeconomic situation. There's positive supply shock. Think back to your graphs. A positive supply shock, anytime positive, that means whatever the variable is in question, here it is supply, it's going to increase. So since supply is shifting to the right, think about the short run effects on the following. Well, if supply is shifting to the right, that means price levels are falling. Employment, they might throw that in there. You got to know the difference between employment and unemployment. Unemployment is people out of work. Employment is people working. So employment is going to increase because real GDP is going to increase. I skipped ahead to part number 4 there. Real GDP is going up, rightward shift in supply. More people working, employment increases. And then the last one, real wages. Remember, real takes out what? It takes out inflation. So if price levels are falling due to the rightward shift in supply, that means real wages are going up. When inflation is going down, whatever real is goes up. Okay? Last part here. The average consumer in Northland, when given a $1,000 raise, spends $750 of it. You got to find the MPC and the MPS. 750 divided by 1,000 would be 0.75. That's your answer for number 1. That's given an additional $1, they're going to spend 75 cents of it. Number 2, all right, well, if number 1 is 0.75, you know it's got to equal 1. It's got to be 0.25, right? If you really wanted to do the math, if people are spending $750 of that 1,000 they're getting, that means they're saving 250 of it. 250 divided by 1,000, 0.25. Let's do one more. Maybe 2 more. Depends on how I'm feeling. The economy of Northland is in long run equilibrium. All right, so now short run equilibrium is right in line with that long run aggregate supply curve. Real GDP is valued at 500 million. The government doesn't like that. They're not satisfied with that. They want more. They want to get it to 600 million. So that's a big giveaway right there. Right there when reading that, we should know, all right, I'm going to have to find the difference between these two numbers. And the government wants to get to that 600 million. They want to do that by decreasing taxes. MPC is 0.8. You have to figure out the change in taxes needed to meet this goal. All right, so I got to go over here. Don't mind this. This is from earlier. All right, so current GDP is 500K. Goal, not 500K, 600K. Difference, 100 big ones, $100,000. Okay, how do we get there? Number 1, find the tax multiplier. Okay, so if MPC is 0.80, that means the MPS is 0.20. 0.8 divided by 0.2, 4. Remember, you can use a calculator on this exam. For stuff like this, you might have to show your work, though, so keep that in mind. Show your calculations. Step 2. Okay, you got the multiplier. What are you doing with it? In this case, you're dividing the goal of $100,000 by 4 by your multiplier. So $100,000 divided by 4. What the heck is that? What the heck is $100,000 divided by 4? I did put 100,000, right? Oh, million. Whoops. Okay. Let me change that. 100,000. It's late. 100 million divided by 4 means that the government would have to cut taxes. Remember, we got to cut taxes $25 million in order to close that gap of $100 million that they're missing. So it's not 600K or 500K, it's million. Sorry about that. Okay. That's part A. Part B, the government. Instead of that, so instead of doing that, the government wants to increase aggregate demand through government spending. Calculate the change in spending needed to meet this goal. So again, they want to figure out how to get to that 600 mil. They still have a goal of $100 million. So instead of finding the tax multiplier, we got to find the spending multiplier. So in order to do that, spending multiplier is 1 divided by MPS. So if MPC is 0.80, that means MPS is 0.20. 1 divided by 0.20 is the big 5. 5, 100 million divided by 5. Look at the difference here. I don't have to cut taxes anymore. I have to increase government spending by 20 million. Lastly, part C, the economy of Northland experiences a recession. Here's your key word there for part C, recession, right? Identify the effect this has on automatic stabilizers in Northland, and then, assuming the government pursues no other action, explain the effect this will have on the government budget. All right, so part 1 of C. Understand that automatic stabilizers don't require any government action. So, if there's a recession, think about what it's going to do to a lot of consumers, to businesses. Businesses are going to close up. They're going to lay their employees off. So what are those employees going to do? Well, they're going to go hunt for other jobs. And in the meantime, they're going to they're going to apply for unemployment benefits. Sorry, my wife's being a comedian in the background. When they're applying for unemployment benefits, that means the government's paying out more on unemployment. So automatic stabilizers such as unemployment are going to increase. Okay, you might have to explain it there. So let's really include that in the question. I'm a real thief of joy, aren't I? All right, then lastly, that has to do with this part 2 has to do with government, no government action and long run corrections. So this is saying that the government isn't doing anything about the recession. The government is saying, we're out, you guys are on your own, figure it out. So think about the relationship I talked about earlier in the long run between wages, input costs, and supply. Okay. Again, keyword here, explain. Got to be able to explain. Long run corrections. All right, I'm toast. I'm done. You have a whole bunch of others. I only got through 2. But I gave you the tools to answer all of these. You're welcome to check them out on your own. Number 6 does have to do with investment. And you should be able to answer this, but this also has a lot of good connections to Unit 5. So if this is something you're struggling with a little bit right now, hold off on it. I will come back to it and circle around when we discuss Unit 5, most likely tomorrow. That being said, that's it.